amongst us. Perhaps not the only one, but certainly a scholar who has 160 publications or more from his PhD in 1984 on factor VIII. He has been in research in Malta, in Scotland. Goodness knows why in Scotland. In Harvard. I didn't know that you liked whiskey that much.
I did my PhD there.
You did your PhD there. There we go. And has, of course, been a regulator with the TGA. For the past few years, he's been with the PPTA as VP of Global Access, and is now both adjunct professor at the University of Western Australia and with Kedrion Spa. Kedrion has nothing to do with spas, by the way.
It's my impression that this is the Italian equivalent of saying, you know, company or something like that. It took me some time to figure it out.
Società per azione.
Whatever.
Or whatever.
Okay, well, thanks very much, John. And I don't have time to make a lot of superfluous remarks, except for the talk. But I just want to say it's very pleasant to be back in this meeting. I had some role in the first two. In fact, in the second one, I found myself elevated to the ranks of the aristocracy, which, as a good socialist, was something I always aspired to. And I just want to also say that it's one of the great honors of my professional life to be introduced by the man who has just spoken. As I once said in a talk to an Australian government committee, in our field, first there was Cone, and then there was curling. I have too many slides, as is my wont. They are available for anybody who wants them, and they'll also be on the website. So I'll try and cover the ground in as good a time frame as possible. I'm asked to talk about this product. Now, here you are, hopefully having a very pleasant time, at the expense, no doubt, of your respective companies. I know I am. And it's all due to this product. This industry lives and breathes on immune globulin. You can see the basic split up of the market here. Obviously, the driver is immune globulin. And thanks to the munificence of what the Americans loosely call their healthcare system, we live off the fact that we can get a good price for this product, particularly in the United States. This is a set of data which I cobbled together from whatever public information there is. Of course, information on prices is never easy to get, but you can see that roughly the price obtainable in the United States, at least as it was last year, is about double what it is in this European, gradually this union. And the demand continues to increase. This is the conventional graph which we all know about in relation to the continuing increase in tonnage and obviously in value. The US is still the leader in every which way. We know that the vast driver in the past few years at least have been the neurological indications. These are now the predominant indication, as I shall show. And we mustn't forget, though, and I will emphasize this, that the primary non-controversial, if you like, indication is still quite probably relatively untapped, and I shall spend quite a bit of time discussing this. It's important to note that when we look at the conventional data generated by MRB, these are not actually drilling down to the ultimate in terms of what is used within a country. For example, in Italy, we have fairly modest usage, pretty much along the average of the European Union. But if you look across the country, there is substantial variation, mostly dependent on the state of development of the healthcare system. So that in the province, which I am now very happy to live in, Tuscany, we have a level of consumption which is close to that of the larger consumers of the Western world. This is important to note. There is always intra-country variation. Now, I want to talk a bit about clinical need because I was charged by John to talk about, the relationship between demand and the plasma supply and so on. I think I'm basically an inadequate substitute for Patrick Robert more than anything. but I have my views. I respect Patrick's estimates and views greatly, of course, and I use them, but I have some somewhat different views myself. And you know that our industry has gone through several generations of demand drivers. As I said, at the moment, the driver, and for the foreseeable future, is immunoglobulin, and I want to tackle this, and I want to address head-on what I call the myth of off-label use. I'll discuss this in a moment. So here is the evidence level of immunoglobulin indications. This is just one of several guidelines. It's the one from the Quad I, from the document developed by the American opinion leaders, authored by Jordan Orange. And you can see here that we have several levels of evidence, la Cochrane, and these are the ones assigned by the Quad I. So interestingly, the indication which I said is non-controversial is allocated on the basis of the holy grail of randomized clinical trials, a slightly lower level of evidence than are the indications based upon autoimmune diseases. You can see that. Now, I note with interest that this business of off-label and inappropriate use is increasingly becoming very important, especially in the countries where the product is used to a large extent. And of course, Canada is the second largest user at the moment per capita. The first is America, the second is my own home country. But the interesting thing in this analysis published by a group in Saskatoon is that, in fact, the level of so-called non-evidence-based use is actually decreasing over the years. And this is important to note, that even in those indications which are supposedly non-evidence, this is becoming less the case. And we all know, as I have said, and this shows a slice of data from the United Kingdom, that neurology now occupies the biggest slice of this space. And this is the case even in the United States, wherever you can get the data. This is a somewhat modest bit of data we generated in the PPTA some years ago, commissioning the Moran Group, simply for physicians' offices. Couldn't get, obviously, private insurance data. This is from Medicare and Medicaid type public information, but you can see that, again, CIDP is the largest single indication in the United States. And I remember you could actually drill down into this data. It was very interesting in 2010. There was only, you will remember, only one product specifically labeled for CIDP in 2010, and yet there was a fairly large spread of consumption in other products. So that's an interesting issue, the question of reimbursement versus regulatory licensure. This is my country. I'm proud of the fact that the National Blood Authority in Australia is immensely transparent, collates and publishes all the data, and you can see that, again, we have the PID indication third in the consumption level, and the highest levels are actually acquired and chronic and CIDP again. And 94% of this usage is at the highest evidence levels. People think, well, you know, this is Australia, it's a rich country, they don't worry too much about money there. Couldn't be far off from the truth. There are many Australians here, there are many CSL people, they know very well that the reimbursement of immunoglobulin is through just one authority in Australia, which is extraordinarily hard-nosed and has commissioned, much to their reluctance, the blood service itself to act as a gatekeeper. Sorry, the voice isn't what it used to be. Okay, now I want to discuss a concept which I've been involved in further developing over the past years, and this is the concept of what I call Father Christmas assessment, which is latent therapeutic demand. This is a concept which my collaborator Jeff Stonebreaker in North Carolina developed for hemophilia some 10 years ago, and it basically seeks to assess through decision analysis the actual potential demand on an evidence-based clinical level if, as I said, Father Christmas had to come, if we didn't have to worry about money, if plasma supply was unlimited, etc., etc. So we worked on this in relation to IG. This is published. I don't have time really to show most of the slides I've got about this, so kindly read the paper. It will increase our citation index. And basically what we did here was to generate a decision analysis model combining the epidemiology and treatment-related variables. As you can see, in this kind of schematic here. Jeff is a whiz kid at this kind of stuff. I don't pretend to understand the statistics. The methodology is well described in his publications, including in this one. He basically uses this statistical variable in order to be able to take into account the uncertainty, and we generate through this very nice, sexy tornado diagram as a result of the one-way sensitivity analysis. And the important thing about this thing, I don't know if I've got, oh yeah, I've got a pointer here, is the ability to generate what is, in quantitative terms, the relative contribution of the different variables. And you can see that obviously for Ig, the dosage and the prevalence are the most important things. But the important thing about this work is that it generates for us an estimate of the evidence-based latent potential demand for the two most common immune deficiencies, which are CVID and X-linked agammaglobulinemia. And we estimate through this model a consumption of 72 grams per thousand, which interestingly is more, as obviously you know, than most of the countries in total of the European Union and other reasonably developed economies are actually consuming today. So that's just the, I keep calling it the non-controversial usage. And in all probability, if you were to actually estimate back of the envelope type the consumption even in the larger consumers, America and Australia and so on, you would find that actually we do not consume that much for PID. So the message is the end is not in sight. Don't worry about it. Plenty of money still to be made even on primary immune deficiency. Now, this is not yet published. We're writing the paper at the moment. We have done the exercise as well for the most important neuropathies. And I won't belabor the point. These are the same kinds of tornado diagrams. So this, I think, is for CIDP. Oops. All right, sorry. This is for CIDP, this is for Guillain-Barré, and this is for MMN. Pretty much the same kind of picture and the kind of picture you'd expect, but reasonably well tailored to the specific diseases and whatever literature we can grab. And this is the result. So basically, for the evidence-based neuropathies, nothing to do with Alzheimer's here. I deplore the deflection of attention of this industry on the wild goose chase, which was the Alzheimer's indication some years ago. This is the bread and butter stuff. No end in sight. We can aspire to 140 grams. So if you combine PID and these three neuropathies, you're over 200 grams per thousand. And we still haven't done ITP and a few other things which are reasonably well accepted. So my message is we are not yet at full demand, even now. Now, however, let me throw some spanners in the work. In relation to PID, for example, this is a composite of two competing clinical concepts. So this is a relationship between the incidence of respiratory infection, of pneumonia, and the trough level achieved. And this is from the data, again, of the meta-analysis of Julian Orange, and you can see a nice linear relationship. But this is from the data on an actual 5-year prospective cohort study by Isabella Quinti in this country, a collaborator of mine, someone who I have immense respect for. And you can see that whereas Orange keeps this sort of relationship through the meta-analysis going down linearly, Isabella finds that at about 400 trough level, there is a leveling off. And this is, I think, quite important because this is essentially, in my opinion, a manifestation of individualized therapy. And I'm given to understand that Paul Perot, in the talk which I unfortunately was unable to attend, mentioned something about personalized medicine. Well, personalized medicine is cutting every which way. So this is a piece of data showing when personalized medicine is used, like evidence-based medicine is used to basically contain costs from a paper in the States, whereby the imposition of a biological level based upon a predetermined trough, rather than on the patient's actual characteristics, led to sequential hospitalization and respiratory infections as under treatment was achieved in order to basically prove the point that the patient actually needed the product. But this paper, and you've got the reference, and I don't have time to go over all these indices, but what this paper does by Isabella's group is actually does the concept in the correct way, slices up the patients according to their phenotype. Quinty has developed this rather neat, sexy algorithm for classifying patients on the basis of pheno and genotype in relation to predicting the need for IgG, and then tailoring treatment in each of the groups, which they have actually identified here to result in different treatment regimens. Now the question is, so what's this going to do to demand? Well, we don't know yet. This is not part of the current paradigm. It is, in my opinion, going to be pretty soon, and I do not know what to predict in terms of what we're going to see in overall demand, but my kind of instinctive reaction is that it's probably going to just keep maintaining the current pattern, but divvying up the clinical share in different ways. So let me now get to the question of, another possible confounder is money. There is huge pressure in cost effectiveness, especially I think in the neurological indications. And this is a set of data from Canada. This is from a group aligned to the Canadian HTA authority, so they are not to be sneezed at. Basically what this says that compared to the conventions of pharmacoeconomic funding of drugs, CIDP is dead in the water. And the same thing happens if you look at therapeutic plasma exchange and IVIG in relation to Guillain-Barré. So we're going to keep on seeing these kind of cost containment pressures, and this could be, well be a confounder in terms of the continuation of the market as money gets tighter and tighter. All right, so now the question which John wanted answered, how much plasma do we need for all this stuff? Well, this is pretty much back of the envelope. I'm collaborating with somebody to try and generate a mathematical model and combine all the variables, the Ig yield, the plasma type, and so on and so forth. But if we assume that usage should be 150 grams, and I've already said it probably considerably more than that. I have this vague feeling that it's going to be more like 250, but let's say 150, okay? And the yield of Ig is about 4 grams, which I think is something which most manufacturers would aspire to, if not attain. Then we need about 37.5 liters of plasma per 1,000. And incidentally, if we are good fractionators and use all the potential of this product, we will get 7.5 IUs per capita of factor 8, and I'll talk about that. Now, what are the options? Well, you know what the options are. We can get it recovered from blood donations, which is the situation in the majority in this country, or we can source it for plasmapheresis. If we stick to a recovered plasma policy, we are looking at the destruction of clinical blood transfusion as we know it, because it will, if we assume 95% of the donations are packed, require this enormous, ludicrous level of whole blood to be collected. Now, you might think that this is a joke and a fairy tale, but I can tell you that before times got tough and the deferrals kicked in and all manner of horrible diseases appeared on the market, which removed our capacity to actually collect blood from most people, this was the practice in my country, and we used to collect blood in order to recover the plasma. This was, 30, 25 years ago as I'm involved in the blood system. Of course, we don't do that because the Australian government has invested enormously in the blood service to increase our plasmapheresis collection, and I'll say something about this, but this just gives you an idea. So obviously we need to go for plasmapheresis. The other reason we need to go for plasmapheresis, and don't worry about the business of this slide, is that the blood sector, the transfusion medicine sector, is collapsing in terms of its need to collect blood. And there's the blowtorch of evidence which has been applied to our guts for so many years is applied to this sector. The consumption of red cells is decreasing, and hence the recovery of plasma. This is the trend, as you can see, from Australia again, from NBA generated data, and we can see that the amount of units of red cells consumed is decreasing, and this is the case everywhere, including Italy. So not so much recovered plasma will be available. Again, data from Australia showing the remarkable success of Australia now. Australia, as I shall show in a later slide, is the world's largest per capita producer of unpaid plasma for fractionation. And this didn't happen because of just of the altruism of the Australian population. It happened because through a very smart program, which I'm proud to have been involved in, which was initiated some years ago, a conversion occurred of the blood donors from whole blood to apheresis, and as I said, the Australian taxpayer picks up the tab in generating high-quality apheresis plasma. So this can be done. I'll skip this. This is just a bit of a personal reflection, and you're going to get more of those later on. And we know that the generation of plasma around the world is still totally dependent, despite all the altruistic intentions and the good intentions of the so-called non-commercial sector. We are still dependent as a global community on commercial plasma, and we are still, unfortunately, in my view, fully dependent on the commercial apheresis population of the United States. And this is shown by Patrick Robert's data over the years, and the vast majority of the plasma, as I said, is from source locations, and the proportion distribution is increasing in favor of source. So there's no question in my mind what we need to do. This is a slide which I cobbled together some time ago, and it shows the world's top plasma producers. So number one, the United States, thanks to the compensated donor population. Austria, very good. I am troubled that the Austrian government apparently wants to fool around with this. I hope it doesn't happen. The noble industry in the Czech Republic, which generates remarkably large amounts of apheresis plasma. Germany, then Australia is the first country on the list in terms of uncompensated. The Dutch have put in substantial efforts, again driven by their ideological, I guess, and moralistic principles, and so on and so forth. The per capita collection in Italy at the moment is roughly half what it is in Australia, and we would hope to see the Italian Blood Service continue its current successful program to increase this amount. I'm going to say something now about the other products, because you remember that I said something about the ability to generate 7.5 IUs per capita of factor VIII if we extract all that we need from immunoglobulin. So this is the situation with factor VIII, and as has been remarked, the vast decrease in consumption has come from recombinant, but we still continue to see this smaller but reasonably high continued increase in consumption of the plasma-derived product. And this is being driven, as I think we heard yesterday in the great talk, through prophylaxis and through the need to perform ITI. Now, Jeff's first foray into LTD in our industry was about 12 years ago, when he derived the first estimate for factor VIII, and in those days, using the therapeutic practices in terms of prophylaxis, etc., which were available around about 2003, he came up with this level of 6.6 IUs in terms of what he then called the unconstrained demand, which is the same as the latent therapeutic demand for factor VIII. Now, you know, of course, that there are many countries, not just a few, but many countries led by Sweden and Germany and others, where this level has been exceeded. And why is this? Was this estimate incorrect? No, it was not incorrect, because clinical developments continue, thank goodness, in hemophilia. And we know, in fact, that for example, the current prophylaxis regimens are inadequate. I mean, why are we so happy that we're managing to attain 1 to 2% trough levels in hemophilia? Totally inadequate. If nature or God Almighty or whoever intended hemostasis to be secured through 1 to 2% of factor VIII, all of us in this room would have 1 to 2% of factor VIII, which I would assume is not the case. This is a slice of data from Kathleen Fisher's group, which shows that, in fact, breakthrough bleeds in hemophilia start to really decrease to non-detectable levels when you exceed 15 to 20% of factor VIII. I would hope that the industry realizes that it has a responsibility to make sure that this happens. And we must anticipate more demand in relation to attaining this good clinical picture. Again, the prospect of individualization of treatment affecting this. This is just a bunch of slides from publications by Peter Collins, who's done a lot of work on this. I personally am not convinced that the way to go is to basically try to put everybody on these longer-acting products. I think they have a role, but I think personalized and pharmacokinetic guided prophylaxis can actually be brought to bear now with the current generation of products because there's a large level of patient variability. We know that 8% of so-called severe factor VIII hemophiliacs just don't bleed. Why is this? We can tailor the therapeutic regimes. We can cut down consumption in some patients. I am firmly of the view that we're probably going to have to increase consumption in many others in order to ensure that the therapeutic promise of the concepts I have been discussing are achieved. And let's now go to the dear old product, which John will discuss much more in the succeeding talk, and I just have some comments. We are still seeing an increase in demand for albumin. God bless the Chinese. It's the only product they allow us to sell, but thankfully they allow us to sell a hell of a lot of it. And I would hope that this happy state of affairs continues for at least the residual years of my career. What about the evidence for this? Well, first of all, here's an interesting thing. We're in Sardinia, right? So this is a slice of data from a publication by Giuliano Grazzini and Gabriele and all these other people who are concerned about the high consumption of albumin in Italy. I personally don't share so much this concern, but it's interesting that in the province of Sardinia, we have the highest consumption of albumin per capita in the world. So, you know, God bless Sardinia. And as to why this is, I haven't got the faintest idea, and nobody else does. All right, but what about evidence-based demand? Well, we did some work on this when I was at the PPTA, and it's continuing. In order to show that through the data generated over the past years on the relative merits of different fluid therapies, particularly in sepsis, that albumin is, the use of albumin in sepsis is evidence-based. It is also cost-effective. And recently, we've continued this work. This is, again, not yet published. In fact, I think it's the first time that I've spoken about this, but we will publish this to show that there is a latent therapeutic demand for the evidence-based indications. Now, again, what is evidence-based in albumin? Difficult to really say. But we have sliced out some relatively uncontroversial indications in hepatology and also cardioarterial bypass grafting in the United States and sepsis. This is just showing the influence, the tornado diagram for, in this case, the different hepatology indications, same type of stuff I showed for IG. And anyway, here's the bottom line. So we estimate on the basis of this, so this has not been published, peer-reviewed, nobody's had the chance to contradict this. We welcome any comments, but we estimate that we are needing about 104 grams per thousand in sepsis, about 61 in cabbage, and combined with the liver disease, which I showed before, we're looking at about 320 grams per thousand in the United States. Now, this is a figure which is not exceeded in many countries. It's definitely exceeded in this country. So the question is there overusage here or wherever this exceeded? These were only 3 groups of indications, and there are others in which we can model where the usage of albumin is perhaps a little more controversial. But I certainly think that there is more to be done in showing that our parent breadwinner from 70 years ago is still a relevant component to this industry. So I have been talking to you a lot about the models and the work I've been involved in, and this is from George E.P. Box, who I think is acknowledged as being the greatest statistician who ever contributed. And remember, all models are wrong, but the practical question is how wrong do they have to be not useful? We look forward to answering that question. Last conclusions, John, and I thank you for your patience. I think that it's clear that the viability of this industry still rests currently on the sale of immunoglobulin, I've said, in the developed markets, in brackets, particularly the United States. If we are to be sufficient in immunoglobulin to meet all potential evidence-based demand, we require higher plasma volumes than is collected in most blood economies at the moment, and this can only be achieved by plasmapheresis, and in my opinion, through the compensation of plasmapheresis donors. We cannot expect that the arduous process we need to generate adequate amounts of plasma can be achieved through normal altruistic-driven donation. It's just too arduous and too time-consuming. Okay, we still generate. I know that all companies generate an enormous amount of cryo. I am uncertain as to how much of this is actually being fed into the supply chain for, economic reasons, but we can still generate a lot of factor VIII from the plasma we need for albumin, and this is product which is needed. And of course, most of you are aware of the work in WFH, which I'm happy to be part of, to try and channel so-called surplus proteins into the supply chain. However, with albumin, I don't know what John is going to say, but my view is that it's difficult not to see a surplus of albumin being generated if we continue all the way from the plasma generated from immunoglobulin need. However, my final thought is that a balanced system is achievable through a convergence of free trade. We need to break down the barriers which still exist, optimal patient care based on real evidence and not Cochrane-imposed dogma and HTA cost-driven issues, and adherence to evidence. I'm still a believer in evidence-based medicine in both plasma procurement and product use. Thank you so much for the attention.
Thank you, Albert, for
What do you want me to do?
this usual tour de force of our situation. And I'm sure there are questions. First from Joe.
Albert, obviously, and I agree with you, you're obviously a fan of compensated procurement development.
I'm a fan of getting plasma. Anybody who gives plasma, fine by me.
Yeah. So I was just, you had that table where there's lots of countries with non-compensated setups. Is there any political will at all in some of these places to develop the compensated areas?
Don't think so. There's a lot of pressure, and sometimes you can feel the debate shifting, kicking and screaming more than otherwise. But what do you think, Joe? Do you think there's ever a possibility in Australia? No, there isn't. Now, you look at Australia. I mean, people say, well, Australia is small and so on, but it's a good case study. In Australia, we had for many, many years a strong so-called self-sufficiency policy. Then it was kind of a bit chipped away under the influence of free trade pressures. We still have a policy based primarily on the national system and the national fractionator, but it doesn't keep up with demand. But the Australian health system is not imposing rationing. This is what makes me so angry. It is clearly the case that in many countries on this continent, what we have is not evidence-based medicine. What we have is rationing. This is what we've got, this is what you'll get. We don't have this in Australia. We have primarily self-sufficiency through a national system, but we permit importation. Now, the other option is, Joe is asking, shall we compensate the donors? I don't think this can have a fly in a social ethic as we have in Australia. And probably we don't need it, because we're doing fine.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Goss. Incidentally, you should call me sir.
He was knighted in Malta. You really, all the data, everything comes from the First World War. What's your view, what's your thoughts on what's going to be happening in the developing world, or the Third World? In India, in China maybe, and in Africa?
Depends on the product and on the local culture. It is my impression that in most of the emerging economies, acute care takes huge precedence over chronic diseases, chronic rare diseases, which have been our traditional market and constituency. So if you look at the consumption of hemophilic products and of IgG, in most of these countries it is miserable, and it's not just a case of needing the money. It's a case of culture, because, as I said, you look at China, consumption of hemophilia and IG products is pretty low, but albumin is, on a per capita, a median consuming country. The thing about China is that there's a hell of a lot of capita in China. So we see this large consumption, but it's actually not an enormous consumer. It's a median consumer on a per capita basis. But of course, we know that the albumin consumption is localized in the major good health economy type of the country. So I think that there are these two things, the financial factors and the cultural factors, acute versus chronic care. I would hope that over the years things shift, but look, there's no use beating about the bush here. We produce expensive therapies. There are very good reasons why we produce expensive therapies. We represent a high value-added type industry. It is not easy to see prices coming from the traditional sector being tailored to be able to supply these things to countries which are extremely poor. On the other hand, I think it's very good to see nascent, and David Stubbings is here, so I don't want to call him nascent, fractionation activities and blood services in some parts of the world which are supplying products. And the situation is definitely improving relative to what was 20 years ago. Can't say anything more, Neil. I hope for the best.
Last question from Harry.
So, Elva, that's a fantastic talk. So, I think that the point in Asia is that it is a developing situation. The ASEAN countries, especially the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, are changing their emphasis, and again from acute to chronic type care situations, and they do have a push in Asia right now for them to try and become self-sufficient. So I think that you are going to be able to see certain changes in the demand for these plasma products as we go on. Now, having said that, and I'm just making a comment, it would be really, really good to get some information from these countries, and at the moment, to try and get any information from any of those countries, it's like pulling hen's teeth. So, you may have a comment on that, but that's my view.
Well, it's true that it's difficult to get the information, and my last comment, though, is this, that I continue to be an advocate for sufficiency, period, globally. I would be immensely gratified if, as happened in our blood economies in the 70s and the 80s, if the need for plasma for fractionation could push the overall development of blood transfusion to a higher level in these countries. This is certainly what happened in our countries. But you come at a stage where, to keep adequate therapy, you cannot depend on just the routine blood service. And if I can make one final comment, I said this in Africa last year, maybe it's time, as in other areas, for these countries to realize that they can take a quantum leap over us. They can, in fact, avoid our mistakes because we damaged severely our blood services by tying them too closely to the need for plasma, and start to invest even now in plasmapheresis. And I do not think that that is an unreasonable thing to aspire to.
Thank you, sir.